Well, I've spent a lot of time around musicians, and I actually consider myself a musician. I'm a music lover, spend a lot of time with music lovers. And if you hang around those types for very long, you eventually come across a person that listens almost exclusively to independent music or indie music, sometimes labeled as a hipster. Does anybody know a hipster? Well, one person, great. I know that there's a shirt for hipsters that says, I listen to bands that don't exist yet. And that truly is their sentiment. They like to know bands that no one else knows about and brag about it constantly. Something really interesting happens, though, when one of these bands that's an independent band signs with a major record label. This fan almost immediately will unfan themselves, and they'll probably hate the next album they put out. They'll say things like, they used to sound raw, but now they sound too produced, which actually means they used to record with really bad equipment, and now they use really good equipment. And you'll also hear them say, they sold out, which really means that they've handed over creative control to somebody else. They no longer get to decide which image they'll portray, what venues they play, what magazines they appear in, and ultimately how their album will sound. I mean, even down to how many songs are on the album and how long are they. The record label even gets to dictate, in a sense, who they're going to target with the album. And so in the midst of all the normalizing and auto-tune and all that happens in that process, hipsters come to the conclusion that at some point, their favorite bands stopped caring about making great music and started caring about selling records. That's a big difference, because in doing so, they lose the only thing that ever made their music any good in the first place, which is its authenticity. It brings us to Luke 11, where Jesus is going to be talking to a group of people about this very thing. Before we dive in there, I got to set up the backdrop for you. During the time of Jesus, there were several different sects. That's CTS. This one time I was talking about sects to high school students, and and I said, I was talking about a text like this, and I was like, yeah, Jesus did not like sex, and they thought it was hilarious. Some of you do. One of those sects was a group of people called Pharisees, and we see them appear like all the way through the Gospels. We've already seen them pop up a few times in Luke, but we haven't talked about them. We haven't given any context for them. They're just kind of there. They're the religious leaders. Unfortunately, they're almost never painted in a good light in the Gospels. And the reason that I say unfortunately is because they had such a good start. You may remember that the story arc of the Old Testament is this family of Abraham that God sets apart. He's going to bring redemption to the whole world through this family. He makes a covenant with these people and says, if you will be I will be your God, and you be my people. You live according to my commands, and I will bless you. Well, the problem is that they don't do that. They constantly are turning away from God, turning to idols, and they're just disobeying God. They reject him as the king. They didn't take the law seriously. They missed their calling of being light to the nations. They big swing and miss on all that. And so this results in the kingdom, we talked about this a few weeks ago, being divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And in the midst of this exile, after both of them are conquered by enemy forces, in the midst of the exile that they go into, out of the southern kingdom arises a group of people who say, now wait a minute, I've got an idea. What if we obeyed God? That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? Maybe all these things wouldn't happen to us that are happening to us if we would just do what God said to do. So let's take this seriously. So they had this oral tradition that had been passed down to them through time, which basically means, the Bible says this, and then there's interpretations around what it says. That's the oral tradition. These things are passed down, and the Pharisees kind of canonize these things, and they live abiding to them. They're really strict on them. But can you blame them? Can you blame them? I mean, the Israelites' historic neglect of the law ended in some bad places, and they wanted to stand faithfully within the covenant that God had established with them. That's all they wanted to do. But by the time that Jesus has come around, and this is generations after the original group of people, their passion for maintaining the details of the law had turned into something else. Jesus doesn't like it. And that might be an understatement when you hear what he has to say to them. Here it is. Luke chapter 11. And I don't even let my kids say some of these words, so that Jesus is going to say to them. When he finished that talk, a Pharisee asked Jesus to dinner. He entered his house and sat right down at the table. The Pharisee was shocked and somewhat offended when he saw that Jesus didn't wash up before the meal. But the master said to him, I know you Pharisees burnish the surface of your cups and plates so they sparkle in the sun, but I also know your insides are maggoty with greed and secret evil. Stupid Pharisees. Didn't the one who made the outside also make the inside? Turn both your pockets and your hearts inside out and give generously to the poor. Then your lives will be clean, not just your dishes and your hands. I've had it with you. You're hopeless, you Pharisees, frauds. You keep meticulous account books, tithing on every nickel and dime you get, but manage to find loopholes for getting around basic matters of justice and God's love. Careful bookkeeping is commendable, but the basics are required. You're hopeless, you Pharisees, frauds. You love sitting at the head table at church dinners, love preening yourselves in the radiance of public flattery. Frauds. You're just like unmarked graves. People walk over that nice grassy surface, never suspecting the rot and corruption that is 6 feet under. That's quite a vivid picture, isn't it? One of the religion scholars spoke up, and I don't know why he does this. Teacher, do you realize that in saying these things, you're insulting us? And Jesus is like, yes. That's why I'm saying them. Yes, and I can be even more explicit. You're hopeless, you religion scholars. You load people down with rules and regulations, nearly breaking their backs, but never even lift a finger to help. You're hopeless. You build tombs for the prophets your ancestors killed. The tombs you build are monuments to your murdering ancestors more than to the murdered prophets. That accounts for God's wisdom, saying, I will send them prophets and apostles, and they'll kill him and run them off. What it means is that every drop of righteous blood ever spilled from the time earth began until now, this is crazy, from the time of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was struck down between altar and sanctuary, is on your heads. Yes, it's on the bill of this generation, and this generation will pay. You're hopeless, you religion scholars. You took the key of knowledge, but instead of unlocking doors, you locked them. You won't go in yourself and won't let anyone else in either. As soon as Jesus left the table, the religion scholars and Pharisees talked about how awesome Jesus was. They went into a rage. They went over and over everything he said, plotting how they could trap him in something from his own mouth. So Jesus has some pretty harsh words to say here to these religious leaders, both the Pharisees and the experts in the law. And I read that in the Message version so that it has a little bit of a modern flavor to it. What is Jesus so upset about? Because he's seemingly a little upset. Well, it's hypocrisy. He doesn't explicitly use the term here for hypocrite, though we translate hypocrite, but he does use it other places where he's talking to the Pharisees, like in Matthew 6. And he certainly captures the concept here, undoubtedly. The Greek word for hypocrite looks a lot like our English word that we translate it into, like that. It literally means a stage player or an actor. Literally one who stands on a stage to act. So figuratively, a pretender, a fraud, a two-faced person. So say you were in ancient Greece. It's a Friday night. I'm going out. Going to go to the theater. Well, you were going to see some hypocrites on stage, which sounds funny for us to say it now because that word has a meaning for us, but like that's the image that Jesus is invoking when he calls the Pharisees hypocrites and frauds. See, there's a distinction between if we would go to a theater here and if you would go to a theater in ancient Greece. And the distinction is this, that in almost every play in ancient Greece, the actors wore masks. They wear masks. I think that's a really important part of this terminology. It helps bring the word to life and the concept to life. See, Jesus sees religious leaders as actors who wear masks to be seen and revered by the crowds for the role they play. And Jesus tells them, hey, you guys are missing the whole point. You don't get it. You're missing the whole point. Jesus has encountered here a group of religious people who want to put an entire culture under the microscope of their behavioral modification program. But Jesus says, look, you guys are only pretending the way that you're teaching other people to live. In another setting, he actually says these things to the Pharisees. You lock people out of heaven and make converts that are twice the children of hell that you are. And then he says that they're like blind people trying to lead other blind people. And when I started looking for God in my life, when I was 18, 19 years old, first time I really picked up a Bible and read through it, started in the Gospels. Lindsay and I read it together. And this is one of the texts, along with many others, where Jesus is saying these types of things that really, really attracted me to Jesus. Because I had never seen this side of Jesus before. I was like, I like this guy. He's cool. Because he doesn't like religious people. And I didn't either. Maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, I don't either. See, Jesus wasn't a fan of religious people. Almost all of the harsh things that he says in the Gospels are pointed at not people that we would label sinners, but religious people. I realized Jesus wasn't interested in fixing my moral code or getting me to live up to all the expectations the religious people around me had set up for me. He was interested in something else. He was interested in me, in my heart. He was interested in restoring my heart. He was interested in giving me new eyes to see the world the way that he sees it. He was interested in love. Imagine a marriage that lacks love, where one person holds high expectations for the other, and the other tries desperately to live up to them. And when they live up to the standards, it's all good. Spouse is pleased, all is well. But when they fail to live up to the expectations, they're repulsed and they refuse to be around them. That's a marriage that's built on performance or the lack thereof, and that's a failed marriage. Whether or not it's failed yet, it will. It's a failed marriage because it lacks something. It lacks authenticity. It forces someone to wear a mask. You can't wear a mask and be in love. Because love requires authenticity. It requires sincerity. This is the type of picture that we have of the Pharisees in their relationship with God. A loveless marriage, essentially. Because they had taken this covenant that God had set out to make with the Israelites. It's a love covenant. Remember the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, the key to the whole law is what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Love is at the center of this covenant. And they had taken it and they had made it a transactional agreement. If we do these things, God will be happy. And if we don't do those things, God will be happy. We call that legalism now. We call it hypocrisy now. And Jesus condemns not one thing more strongly. Because what Jesus desires, as we saw with the woman, the prostitute who comes in and washes his feet with her hair, and all these religious leaders are sitting around like, what is going on? I don't approve of this. What he desires is authentic worship. What he wants is you. What he wants is me. That's why we see him eating and drinking with prostitutes and tax thieves. It's why we see him healing people on the Sabbath day. It's why we see him teaching over and over again that what God really wants is our hearts. Not strict observance of some moral code. So are you authentic with God? Are you sincere with God? Are you seeking to satisfy him with the way you live? Or are you seeking him that you might be satisfied? There's a big difference. Of course, the Pharisees had a problem with how they related to God, but how did that play itself out? In the way they related to other people. They're always connected. Relationship with God and your relationship to other people are always connected. So are you authentic and sincere with others? I think there's something that attracts us to authenticity. Like we like it, we want it, but we're afraid to give it because it's dangerous, it's vulnerable to be authentic and sincere with people. It's dangerous and vulnerable to be authentic with God, even. It requires something of us. We don't like it. Our world, especially our culture, I would say, emphasizes marketing. And I love marketing. Read marketing books and stuff like that, and I appreciate a good commercial. But the definition of marketing is to manage perception. So what a marketing department's doing when they're looking at a product and they're looking at you and they're saying, how can I manage their perception of our product? Most of the time it has little to do with the actual product, and mostly to do with the way that you feel about the product. That's what marketing is, a management of perception. I think that if we're honest with ourselves, that's a tendency that we all have. Like when we come in here on a Sunday morning, are we marketing ourselves? Trying to manage other people's perceptions of us? Like, we've got stuff together. We've got it together. We're good. Do we manage people's perceptions by the clothes that we wear? Do we manage people's perceptions by the cars that we drive, by the houses that we live in? Do we try to manage people's perceptions on social media? I made up a statistic. You know, 78% of them are made up anyway, which is that 99% of the interaction that we have with 80% of most of the people we know happens outside of actual social interaction if you're on social media. And that doesn't mean that social media is a bad thing. It just does mean that there's an opportunity for us to manage people's perceptions by the pages that we like, the things that we share, the things that we post, the pictures we post, so on. The person that we project on the surface is typically the person that we wish we were, or the person that we think other people think we should be. So the problem with marketing ourselves is that we can deceive people into thinking that we're in better shape than we are. You just look down your row, you know, the people that you're sitting with, and they're probably worse off than they're showing you right now. You're like, well, how do you know that? Well, because you're probably worse off, and I'm probably worse off than we're revealing, right? We're marketing ourselves. That's what we do. The church, I don't know, for some reason, is a place where this happens really easily because we think that we have to have it all together. We think that we have to be living up to a certain standard to be acceptable. That could play itself out in a number of ways. But at Crossview, we want to create an environment where you can feel comfortable and letting your guard down enough so that people can actually see you for who you are. You don't have to join a masquerade to be a part of this community. Why? Well, because Jesus doesn't honor mask wearing. He doesn't like mask wearing. Jesus went to a cross so you can take off your mask. You don't have to pretend anymore. You can let people see who you really are. The church is a group of flawed people who share their struggles and failures, who share their doubts and their insecurities, who share their freedom and their hope with one another. I once heard when people criticize Christians for being hypocrites, some people respond with this: there's always room for one more. But this is a misinformed use of the word hypocrite. There isn't any room for hypocrisy in Jesus' church, actually. There is no room for mask wearing. There is no room for pretending that you're close to God to gain the approval of others. There is no room for holding unattainable expectations for the people around you while knowing that you don't live up to that standard yourself. There's no place for that in Jesus' church. Because Jesus' church is a gathering of people who have already flatly confessed that they have not lived up to the standard, that they cannot live up to the standard, that they will not ever live up to the standard. And that's why the cross was necessary. There is no pretense at the foot of the cross. There is no room for pride at the foot of the cross. There is only room for our failure. There is only room for our weakness. There is only room for our sincere and honest confession that we are in fact broken, and we are in fact desperately in need of a Savior. The leaders in Jesus' day could not bring themselves to confess that. So Jesus calls them frauds. Frauds because you think that you can get to God by the way that you live. You're a fraud because when you walk into a gathering of people in the marketplaces, they're praising you for how great you are, for how moral you are, and inside, you're disgusting. Let's not make that same mistake. Paul plays off of this 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He says that God has chosen to place this amazing message inside broken, common people. He used the imagery, jars of clay. And the song that we're going to sing evokes that imagery. I'm going to read a few words from it. But while I do that, would you stand with me? I love these lyrics because I think they capture the heart, the essence of the gospel, which is that none of us deserve it, and yet all of us are invited in. You take our failure, you take our weakness, you set your treasure in jars of clay. So take this heart, Lord, I'll be your vessel, the world to see your love in me.